Dieses Video wird dir präsentiert von helden.de, deinem zuverlässigen Partner für Fahrrad- und E-Bike-Versicherungen. Mit dem Heldencode aus der Videobeschreibung sparst du zusätzlich noch den ersten Monatsbeitrag und unterstützt dadurch diesen Kanal Fahrradstadt Hamburg.
As a warning to headphone users, I'll show this icon when it's about to get loud. It's about to get loud. Cities can be loud, really loud. We all know this, but we don't often talk about the implications of noise pollution on our health and happiness in cities. So I was really glad to see a whole chapter devoted to urban noise pollution in the new book by Chris and Melissa Bruntlett. Far too often, noise concerns are dismissed as a minor inconvenience. But this chapter of Curbing Traffic has lots of fascinating research about the very real health consequences of urban noise, where it comes from, and what cities can do about it. Noises over about 85 decibels can cause hearing loss, but there are other health implications that have been discovered when people are exposed to constant noise levels above about 55 decibels, which is the maximum amount of average noise considered acceptable by the WHO. And 65% of Europeans live in places with average noise levels above this limit.
Ja.
Of course, many other cities are much worse. Cairo, Egypt averages 90 decibels during the day, 11 times the WHO guidelines and into the range of permanent hearing loss. And in Karachi, Pakistan, rush hour noise levels have been measured at over 140 decibels, which is an insane 360 times higher than the WHO guidelines and about as loud as the deck of an aircraft carrier. But even at much lower levels, noise triggers the stress response in almost all vertebrates. But since humans are good at adapting to our environment, we don't often realize when we're exposed to noise levels that are harmful to our health.
Ja, und traurig, dass wir genau für diese Szene eine Szene aus München und Deutschland haben. Ja, und dieser ganze Lärm, den wir bisher gehört haben, der kommt nicht von lachenden Kindern, sondern der kommt genau nur und einzig allein von Autos. Und deswegen, also ich beneide niemanden, der bei uns zum Beispiel hier an der Wandsbeker Chaussee direkt wohnt, bei einer 6-spurigen Hauptstraße. Also da kannst du wirklich kein Fenster aufmachen. Wer will so leben? Und wir akzeptieren das so.
Long-term exposure to noise is associated with several negative health outcomes, including heart disease, hypertension, high stress levels, and faster cognitive decline. Noise disturbs people's sleep as well, and this can be caused by a single roaring engine, siren, horn, or car alarm. Traffic noise has effects over the quality and quantity of sleep, which over time leads to cardiovascular problems, focus problems, and even obesity. But noise also affects our behavior as well. A study in San Francisco found that exposure to traffic noise made people less likely to speak to others, assist strangers, remain patient, and demonstrate generosity, and more likely to prematurely end conversations, become agitated, disagreeable, and argumentative.
Ja, man ist einfach grundsätzlich gereizt. Wenn man den ganzen Tag zu Hause auch so einem Lärm ausgesetzt ist, man ist grundgereizt. Man ist schon, selbst auf dem normalen Level hat man schon eine Gereiztheit drauf, müssen andere erstmal hinkommen.
It's also very clear from the research in the Bruntlett's book that the overwhelming majority of noise in cities is caused by motor vehicles. Reading this chapter reminded me how annoyed I get when suburbanites say they hate the city because it's noisy and polluted, when the reason it's noisy and polluted is because of the cars that suburbanites insist on driving into the city.
Ja, genau das Thema, was wir eben hatten mit den Menschen, die durch diese Straße einfach nur durch wollen, die den Lärm verursachen. Aber ausbaden müssen das die Menschen, die dort wohnen und leben und nicht die den Lärm dorthin bringen. Zum großen Teil. Nämlich Durchgangsverkehr.
Part of the problem is that people driving cause a lot of noise pollution, but experience very little of it themselves as they sit inside of their soundproof cabin. The most obvious example of this is the car horn, which at 110 decibels will scare the crap out of anybody outside of a car. Here's my hot take. Car horns should be as loud on the inside of the car as they are on the outside.
Ja, das ist eine gute Idee. Das ist eine super gute Idee. Wenn du auf die Hupe drückst, dann ist die Hupe im Auto genauso laut wie draußen. Ja, dann würden sich einige wahrscheinlich dreimal überlegen, ob sie wirklich auf die Hupe drücken sollten. Sehr gute Idee.
Urban noise has become so normalized and so pervasive that we just take it for granted that cities are going to be loud. It's become normal for city dwellers to buy noise-canceling headphones for their walk to work. But it doesn't have to be this way. It is possible to significantly reduce urban traffic noise, and many countries have noise pollution laws, including the US, the UK, the EU, and many others, but very few have the political will to actually do anything about it. Dutch cities are significantly quieter than most other cities, and much of that can be attributed to the Wet Geluidhinder Act of 1979. One Dutch city that has taken the issue of noise very seriously is Delft, which is where the Bruntlets happen to live and the place that they write about in their book. So I decided to buy a decimal meter and get on a train for the first time in a year and hear what all the fuss was about. When you step out of the train station in Delft, you're immediately struck by the deafening silence.
Wenn du in Deutschland aus vielen Hauptbahnhöfen aussteigst, ob das Hamburg ist, ob das andere Städte sind, hast du direkt vorm Bahnhofsgebäude erstmal eine schöne sechsspurige Hauptstraße, ja, wo die Autos an dir vorbeirauschen und du eigentlich gar nicht weißt, was ja eigentlich gerade passiert. Und das ist eigentlich das Erschreckendste daran. Du kommst aus den Hauptbahnhöfen raus und hast eigentlich eine Lärmbelästigung ohnegleichen. Furchtbar.
It's remarkable how quiet it is. My decimal meter was showing below 55 dBA, which is about that of a typical household refrigerator. Pretty quiet for the area right outside of a train station. By the way, all of my noise readings are in dBA, which is decibels weighted for noise perceived by human hearing. If you want to learn more about the differences between decibels and dBA, or how to compare logarithmic decibel values, well, you got a web browser, open it. The street outside the station in Delft is Phoenixstraat, and until recently, there was a major elevated rail line that was a significant source of noise. In 2014, a tunnel was completed, moving the rail line underground, and instead of turning the area into a 6-lane strode like you just know they would do in the US or Canada,
Oder Deutschland.
they used the space to build some low-traffic streets, a dedicated transit right-of-way, and a canal. This new design now met the maximum noise requirements, so the city was permitted to build more housing and office space in the area. So what are some of the things that Delft has done to make the city so quiet? Well, since motor vehicles are the largest source of noise pollution, the best solution is to reduce traffic volumes, which of course has other benefits as well. The city has implemented a traffic circulation plan that routes motor vehicles away from the city center as much as possible, and they encourage public transit and cycling as alternatives.
Das ist auch ein Fehler, den wir oft machen. Wir reden immer davon, Verkehr irgendwie zu verdrängen oder woanders hinzuschieben. Aber das kann ja gar nicht das Ziel sein. Das Ziel muss ja sein, den motorisierten Individualverkehr allgemein zu verringern innerhalb der Stadt, unnötigen Verkehr umzulenken auf ÖPNV, Fahrrad, zu Fuß, ja, weg vom Auto. Und darüber reden wir eigentlich viel zu selten, sondern wenn wir irgendwie eine Straße umbauen, dann tun wir immer so, als wenn der einzige Zweck des Ganzen ist, irgendwie Autos woanders hinzuschieben. Aber wir müssen eigentlich mehr darüber nachdenken, Verkehr allgemein vom Auto wegzulenken auf andere Mobilitätsarten. Ja, der Verkehr kann ja stattfinden, es kann auch der gleiche sein, es kann von mir aus auch mehr sein, aber es muss halt einer sein, der nicht in einem Auto stattfindet. Mit einer Person in einem Auto, sondern halt anders. Und da kannst du auch dreimal so oft unterwegs sein, setzt dich halt dreimal so oft aufs Fahrrad, aber es ist viel angenehmer, als wenn du nur einmal mit dem Auto fährst. Und da müssen wir mehr hin.
The Markt in Delft is a beautiful and peaceful historic square where you
Wow.
can hear birds chirping, church bells ringing, and the murmur of conversations from people dining nearby.
Und was hätten wir? Wir hätten hier eine Hauptstraße. Herzlichen Glückwunsch.
Can you believe that this was a car parking lot until as late as 2004?
Ja, kann ich mir
What do you
vorstellen.
think it sounded like when this photo was taken in the
Laut.
1970s? With the cars removed, the pedestrianized city center gets so quiet that I was able to measure sound levels below 40 dBA, which is as quiet as a library. Well, unless the Albert Heijn is throwing an opening party, then it's a bit louder. It's really enjoyable to be here. There's a sense of calm and peacefulness that you get when going somewhere quiet, and this was something the Bruntlets mentioned in their book. When they lived in Vancouver, they used to escape to the forest or a cottage, and this is something they thought they would miss moving to the Netherlands. But what they found was that it wasn't so much the forest they were craving, but a break from the incessant noise of the city. And here in Delft, they can get that any day just by walking into the city center. But if you can't remove motor vehicles, then the next best thing is to slow them down. The noise from cars comes from two major sources.
Ja.
Propulsion noise, created by the car's engines, exhaust, transmission, and brakes, and rolling noise, which is caused by the tire friction with the road surface. We very often focus on the propulsion noise, but for most cars, the noise from the tires becomes significant at about 30 kilometers an hour, and over 55 kilometers an hour, it becomes louder than the engine itself.
Ja.
It is possible to reduce tire noise significantly by using low-noise tires, but manufacturers have lobbied against this for years because they're dicks. So if you can't mandate low-noise tires, what you can do is slow the cars. Reducing vehicle speeds from 50 kilometers per hour to 30 kilometers per hour will typically reduce noise by about 6 decibels.
Ja, und deshalb reden ja ganz viele Städte und Gemeinden wollen ja Tempo 30 in den Städten haben. Und wer blockiert ist, wer kriegt es nicht auf die Kette, wer sagt, dass das alles auf jeden Fall nicht möglich ist, ja, unser Freund Herr Wissing. Ja, und auch das ist ein wichtiger Punkt. Wenn du die Geschwindigkeit rausnimmst, nimmst du den Lärm raus. Und gerade wenn es um Städte geht, wo Menschen leben, wo Menschen wohnen, ist das ein wichtiger Faktor, dass du durch Temporeduzierung die Gefahr, die vom Auto ausgeht, reduzierst, aber gleichzeitig auch, und das ist fast genauso wichtig, den Lärm. Und dadurch machst du wieder Stadtteile lebenswerter, die vorher durch Lärm, durch Abgase nicht lebenswert waren. Ist natürlich nur ein Teil muss natürlich sein, weniger Autos zu haben, aber die da sind, dürfen auch gerne leiser sein.
Yet another reason why vehicle speed should be less than 30 kilometers an hour in urban areas.
Ja, danke.
Another strategy, used extensively in Delft, is quieter, porous asphalt. This kind of road surface can reduce rolling noise by up to 6 decibels. When I learned about quiet asphalt, it explained what I had experienced when I first arrived in Amsterdam by train. Look at how close the highway is at Amsterdam Zuid station, and yet the traffic is remarkably quiet. I've stood next to a lot of highways when making these videos, and they are nowhere near this quiet in any other country I've filmed in. Porous asphalt is more expensive than regular asphalt, but it's up to 10 times cheaper than installing noise barriers and soundproofing. Plus, it really only needs to be used on roads with higher speeds, and for safety reasons, most Dutch streets have 30 km/h speed limits anyway, which means that very few roads need this kind of expensive treatment. Finally, as a last resort, soundproofing can be installed, such as these green barriers recently installed at a school in Delft. These were installed because noise from the adjacent arterial road, as well as a nearby highway, were above permitted noise levels.
Ja, traurig, wenn du solche Maßnahmen ergreifen musst, ne? Wenn du solche Maßnahmen ergreifen musst, das ist wirklich äußerst traurig.
Visiting Delft was really enjoyable. It's amazing to see a city that takes noise pollution so seriously. And even outside of the city center, Delft was remarkably quiet. Returning to Amsterdam, things aren't quite as peaceful as Delft, but it's still remarkably quiet. The area around Amsterdam Zuid station, where my train arrives, is the financial district, an area that's mostly pedestrianized. Every financial district should be designed like this. After my trip to Delft, I was curious how much noise was created by different kinds of vehicles, so I headed to a nearby street in the early evening where traffic was light enough to get individual readings of vehicles as they passed. Keep in mind that the decimal is a logarithmic scale, and 60 dBA is twice the perceived loudness as 50 dBA. The lowest reading I took, during a gap in motor vehicle traffic, was just over 42 dBA, about as loud as the inside of a quiet house. A passing cyclist was about 55 dBA, and an e-bike was about 60 dBA. A group of cyclists riding together and talking was around 65 dBA, which, unsurprisingly, is about as loud as a normal conversation.
Ganz merkwürdig. Wäre mal nicht drauf gekommen.
When it comes to peak noise levels, 65 dBA is about the level that starts to become irritating to most people. So when we're talking about noise in the city, it's peak noise levels above about 65 dBA. The sound of passing cars varied significantly by speed, but it was usually around 73 dBA. Heavier vehicles like SUVs and vans were about 76 dBA, more than 4 times louder than a bicycle, and 10 times louder than the ambient noise of the street itself. One of the louder vehicles, and the most common source of noise complaints in Dutch cities, is mopeds. They are everywhere in Dutch cities.
Ja, das
They're about
stimmt.
twice as loud as a typical car. Of course, there are not nearly as many mopeds here as where we lived in Taiwan, but because Dutch cities are quieter than most other cities, they stand out a lot more.
Gottes Willen, das ist ja furchtbar.
I cannot tell you how many peaceful street scenes I've filmed that have been ruined by a passing moped.
Ja, die sind wirklich laut. Die sind wirklich laut.
Dutch cities will never be quiet until we do something about these leaf blowers on wheels. The worst offender, though, by far, is what my kids call farting motorcycles. They're pretty clever kids, so I'm going to assume that's the accepted term. Now,
Was war das für ein Ding?
the worst offender, though, by far, is what my kids call farting motorcycles.
Hä? Wozu braucht man das? Ist das ein Feature?
They're pretty clever kids, so I'm going to assume that's the accepted term. Now, motorcycles can be better for the city if people choose to drive motorcycles instead of cars, but there's no denying that farting motorcycles are really, really, really loud. They were by far the loudest noise source in my test at over 100 dBA, 6.5 times louder than a car and 22 times louder than a bicycle. Farting motorcycle enthusiasts may tell you that they need that sound for safety, though there's no evidence for this claim, and there's good reason not to believe it because most of the sound is emitted behind the vehicle. But what would be better for safety of motorcyclists, of course, would be to focus on making the streets themselves safe.
Ja.
Because then they would also be safe enough for pedestrians, cyclists, and other people who don't find it necessary to interrupt every conversation within a 2-kilometer radius. I cannot wait for these things to go electric. But there is
Das kannst du eigentlich nur, tierische Egoisten, die der Meinung sind, dass deren Lärm irgendwelche anderen Menschen jetzt glücklich machen würde. Aber den meisten Menschen geht sowas einfach nur tierisch auf die Eier.
wait for these things to go electric. But there is a legitimate safety concern with electric vehicles. At low speeds, they're too quiet for pedestrians to hear, which is why electric cars in Europe are now required to make a noise when traveling at low speed. So electric vehicles are definitely an improvement, but only at low speeds where rolling noise is minimal. In fact, electric cars may be even worse at high speeds because tire noise increases with tire width as well as by weight. The Italian-designed Biro microcar is quite quiet. No complaints here. But Teslas, for example, are designed primarily by and for Americans, so they're excessively large and heavy vehicles, and my sound readings reflected that. A passing Tesla had a noise level of about 73 dBA, which was equivalent to farting cars going the same speed.
Ja.
So at speed, there's not a huge difference between the sound of a farting car and an electric car. Which means the only way electric cars will significantly reduce urban noise is if they're speed limited within cities, which, for safety reasons, they should be anyway, but lots of policymakers are still in denial about this.
Oh ja.
Electric trucks make a bigger difference because truck engines are so loud, though this electric truck could really use some oil. A typical major arterial road rarely dips below about 80 dBA, and you might argue that this is just the price to pay for mobility.
Nein, ist es nicht. Nein, ist es nicht.
But consider this street, Plantage Mittellaan in Amsterdam, one of my personal favorites. This street has only a tram line and bicycle path, and that gives it a carrying capacity of over 12,000 people per hour, which is equivalent to an 8-lane stroad.
Deswegen, es kann ja Verkehr stattfinden. Das sagt ja auch niemand. Das ist mal das Interessante, wenn man mit anderen Leuten spricht, dass die dann sagt, man will Verkehr verbieten. Nein, Verkehr kann ja gerne stattfinden und auch Mobilität muss ja auch stattfinden. Aber müssen diese 12.000 Menschen unbedingt auf einer 8-spurigen Hauptstraße mit Lärm und allem drum und dran stattfinden? Oder können diese 12.000 Menschen auch Mobilität erfahren an so einem Ort, was viel ruhiger und viel weniger gefährlich ist. Ja. 8-spurige Hauptstraße, diese ruhige Straße. Beide Straßen transportieren 12.000 Menschen. Ja. Und da gibt es immer noch Menschen, die unbedingt eine 8-spurige Hauptstraße wollen.
And yet, it was almost always below 55 dBA, only occasionally peaking at 76 dBA when a tram went by. Or consider Vondelpark, which is a high-capacity bicycle highway during rush hour, but it's almost completely silent. Living in the Netherlands really made me realize that cities aren't loud. Cars are loud. And moving lots of people doesn't need to be loud.
Ja.
Also, grassy tram tracks are the best, and they absorb noise too. So given all of the health and social problems created by loud motor vehicles, it's reasonable to ask, why do we still allow them in cities? But in order to avoid being too one-sided here, what are some of the arguments against banning loud vehicles from our cities? Me like cargo vroom vroom. Yeah, that's a tough one. I can see why so many cities...
Entschuldigung. Sorry. Ich war so. Guck erstmal weiter.
Too one-sided here. What are some of the arguments against banning loud vehicles from our cities? Me like cargo vroom vroom. Yeah, that's a tough one. I can see why so many cities have trouble with this decision. I'm very thankful to live somewhere that takes noise pollution seriously. Amsterdam has created noise maps like this one that show the daily noise levels around the city weighted by time of day. And they have a concrete plan, or is it an asphalt plan, to address noise pollution in the city, a city that is already significantly quieter than other cities.
Entschuldigung.
Of its size. I haven't left the Netherlands for over a year and a half now, and I've gotten very accustomed to the lower noise levels here. So I'm curious to see what it'll feel like to be back in car-infested fake London when I visit this summer. But wherever I travel, I know that when I return, I'm going to be very glad to step off the train in Amsterdam Zuid and finally enjoy some peace and quiet.
Ja.
I'd like to thank my supporters on Patreon who pay me to measure the noxious emissions of farting cars. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to bonus videos, visit patreon.com/notjustbikes.
Ja. Ja, genau. Ich hab's. Ich hab zwar vom Rest des Videos nicht mehr viel. Ihr habt zwar vom Rest des Videos nicht mehr viel mitbekommen, aber ich glaube, es war gut. Ich glaube, es war gut. Ja, ich glaube, das war gut. Und wenn er das auch macht, danke auch nochmal bei mir an meine Patreons, die meinen Kanal immer so fleißig unterstützen. Das ist ein wichtiger Beitrag zum Erhalt dieses Kanals auf jeden Fall. Es trägt einen großen Beitrag, was die Einnahmenseite dieses Kanals angeht. Deshalb auch nochmal danke an meine Patreons, die immer an jedem Ende eines jeden Videos auch genannt werden und die dort abgebildet werden. Danke euch, dass ihr den Kanal von mir so stark unterstützt. Und auch danke an die immer fleißig, jetzt auch schon manchmal zum zweiten Mal mittlerweile, ihr Prime-Abo oder ihr normales Abo dagelassen haben. Das hilft mir bei dem Kanal auf jeden Fall weiter, weil das Verpixeln der Videos doch schon eine ganze Menge Geld auffrisst. Also das war zu viel. Das war zu viel.
Do you remember all the places we went, the spaces we